Hey everyone, this is Ben Atkinson at LinkedIn, and this is our interview series, Inspiring Leadership and Challenging Times. So each week on a Tuesday, we explore someone's journey into becoming a leader and their trials and tribulations along the way. And as always, we have along with us my friend Jonathan Bowman-Perks, leadership expert and leadership coach. Jonathan, who are we interviewing this week?
Yeah, I was just thinking about being a leadership expert. An X is a has-been and a spurt is a small drip under pressure, they always say. So I'm always wary of being an expert. And I would love one day to go live on my site. We'll get that live one day. We'll have that working. Very lucky to be working with Martin Dougherty. And Martin is the COO at the Wellcome Sanger Institute on the Genome campus. And before we talk about Martin, I just would like to acknowledge Ben, because Ben, it's been great working with. This is episode 8. Ben and I go back to when I was the visiting professor at leadership at Cass Business School, and Ben was the brightest student on our, that'll be arguable from the others, they'll all argue about that, on our MBA program, Big Tech MBA program. But no, you stood out at the time, and we became good friends, and we've stayed in touch since, and he's one of the rising stars in LinkedIn. So Ben, it's great working with you. I just want to acknowledge that publicly.
Thanks very much. Great working with you, Jonathan.
All right.
And welcome, Martin.
I hate to break this up, guys.
I know, it's a bit of a lot, isn't it? So back over to Martin. So Martin has had a fascinating career in 4 sectors: academia, commercial, charity, public. He also is a special constable for the police, which he does at his weekends when he's not working so very hard as the CEO of a huge campus. But Martin, tell us a bit about Wellcome, firstly, but tell us a bit about your role.
Yeah, certainly. So I'll start off with Wellcome. Wellcome is I think the world's second largest medical charity. They sponsor research in the UK. They sponsor research all over the world. And actually, my career started with Wellcome. I was a Wellcome fellow just after I finished my PhD. So in some ways, I've gone full circle, which is really quite rewarding. I mean, they're based down in London. They're completely independent. They advise on policy and many other areas of science as well. Very active, very supportive charity looking after UK science. And the campus I operate and the institute I work at is basically a wholly owned subsidiary of Wellcome, and that's the Sanger Institute and the Wellcome Genome campus. The campus was originally conceived just over sort of 25 years ago, and the idea at that point is Wellcome saw that how important it was going to be to sequence the genome of the first human ever, and there was a bit of a race on between this happening in a kind of international collaborative way and this happening on a kind of commercial basis. So there was a big investment from Wellcome. They purchased the campus, started the Wellcome Institute, or Wellcome Centre as it was, the Sanger Centre as it was then, and the Sanger Centre contributed something like a third thereabouts of the first human genome, which took nearly 10 years and cost $3 billion. And now we can do literally, hundreds, if not thousands, of whole human genomes a month. So the science is
to the layman, Martin, to sequence the genome. Why has that been so world changing, really?
Yeah. So you imagine that if you're an architect, you need the designs to be able to build a house or build an office, and a house and an office isn't the same. So those blueprints look slightly different. And in effect, your genome is your blueprint for your body. Every cell in your body, other than red blood cells, has a genome. That genome is read inside your cell, and then all the proteins that are kind of pulled together after that are the action things that make your cells work. So your genome in your cells in your brain is the same as the genome of the cells in your heart. It's just how that code is read and then expressed that gives the variation you see around those organs. And obviously, all of our genomes are unique to us, and that's why we are individuals in effect. So that's the campus, and the Sanger Institute has grown and thrived from there. Over the last sort of 25 years, in around about 2000, the first human genome was fully sequenced. People kind of said, "Oh, that's genomics done. We've got the blueprint." But basically, it's it's led to new areas of science that we hadn't even imagined a couple of decades ago. And the kind of exponential rate of generating genomic and other biological data is kind of almost it has outstripped Moore's law. We have a sister institute on the campus, which is the European Bioinformatics Institute, and the construct of having the data generator, which is the Sanger Institute, and the EBI, which is, if you like, the library that homes all of this data and produces services, is a really powerful mixture for both informatics and for genomics. So about 2,500 people in total on the campus.
That's fantastic. 2,500. That's a huge amount. And you are in the moment in the role of COO, dealing with lots of stuff going on. I mean, you've probably been busier than you've ever been when we were speaking to you earlier. And of course, the biggest thing that happened to you recently was the COVID-19 crisis and the pandemic, not only for how you ran as the operator of the Sanger Institute, but also what extra help the government was asking you to do. So do you want to just tell us a bit about how you dealt with that crisis, what you've learned from it, about leadership generally, and just general themes and stuff that you've learned about dealing with a crisis?
Yeah.
Interesting to hear your views.
Yeah, I think the thing that that sort of resonated the most with me over the last sort of 10 weeks or so is flexibility. With the best will in the world, one can have all the training in place in crisis management and these sorts of things, but actually when it comes to an event like we have at the moment, I don't think there's any amount of training that prepares people properly. So I think, for me, closing the campus was a relatively straightforward thing to do. That was, we probably did that just a couple of days ahead of the total lockdown in good order. But the real challenge has been, making sure that people feel that sense of identity with the Institute, despite the fact all of us, or many of us, are working from home. So there are some things we put in place to do that. Obviously, thinking about people's mental health and their well-being in these different sort of environments is really important. And again, the Institute, has put things in place to help people work through that. And then the real challenge really is reopening, and reopening as a kind of COVID secure employer. Our crisis management team had been thinking for a number of weeks around how we might go through this process. And, they're a great team, actually, I have to say. And they kind of almost double guessed, or certainly second guessed, pretty much what was going to be in the new health and safety legislation around COVID and social distancing and being a COVID secure employer. So lots of those things were already in place. But there is an exquisite complexity, I think, for every employer at the moment, which is, how do you use your facilities in the most appropriate way to be as successful in achieving your strategy and objectives, given that we are working in such a different way. And for us, some of that was around making quite difficult decisions, that there are some of our staff that physically have to be at the site to do their work. If they're working in the laboratories or in the big sort of sequencing pipelines, they have to be there to do that. So we have made a decision that people that obviously can still work from home will work from home, and we will get people to site that physically have to be there to do their jobs. And the site looks very different. The campus is designed to convene people. Science is all about collaboration and people working together successfully. And all of a sudden, in our diner, there are these sad-looking chairs and tables that are 2 meters apart from each other, and one person sat at each table, and signage everywhere, and it looks and feels quite different. And I think also part of my role and my team's role is to prepare people in thinking about what that will mean for them as an individual when they do come back onto campus.
Yeah, and it's a really good point. Many of the different leaders that I've talked to, thinking about the legal implications of how do you get people back? You can't force them back if they don't want to come back. What is your legal responsibilities? What will happen if people sue you? And how do you can see that problem with the teachers and things like that. So that's dealing with a crisis. Then let's talk a bit about inspiring leaders in a crisis. And who would you pick as an example at any level, really, of an inspiring leader you've worked with, and what qualities they showed in a crisis, which we can all learn from those people?
Yeah. So I think I do think about this quite often. I think leadership can happen at pretty much any level across an organization. But there's one individual, one group of people that I worked with in a previous role. And that's when I was at the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists, running a health service research group for NICE. And it became evident that obstetricians that deliver babies, midwives that deliver babies, they have to keep a cool mind. And actually, in developing some of those guidelines, we had some really quite tricky times that perhaps some of our recommendations weren't kind of fully aligned with the politics at the time. And there was a particular professor of midwifery who, as the chair of my board, had such a calm, almost like stoical presence, and would think very calmly and clearly through those issues when perhaps, a few of the people around us was really starting to get very animated and worried about things. And I actually learned a huge amount from that, to be honest with you. And as you'll know, Jonathan, I've subsequently gone on to do quite a lot of reading around stoicism and actually, being prepared actually, for these sorts of events.
And talk a bit about that, because I do, like your experience about keeping calm and putting things in perspective. If there were a couple of things you took as a leadership tip from the Stoics, what would be the little sayings that have helped you practically?
I think so. One of them is that tension between sort of emotional attachment and empathy, which is really important, yet still being able to kind of keep some distance from decision making. That balance, the sort of tension between those issues, I think is really, really important. And being able to, take a moment of calmness when things are getting really tough, and learning some breathing exercises and these sorts of things, practical things that you can do, not just to manage your kind of emotional state, but also your physiological state. And these things are really quite important.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier about your time as a special constable, and sometimes when you get thrown into a crisis there, I thought you had a lovely story. Can we jump to that?
Yeah, of course.
How you might have to manage your emotions when things go wrong and you're on your own.
So this was I was called double crew. So I was with another partner at the start of the job, and we'd gone to one site and we did what's called a scene preservation. There'd been a stabbing, and it was our job to make sure we looked after the site. And then all of a sudden we had another job, and my colleague was called away. And eventually I took off the scene pres and jumped in the van and was heading back to the hospital where my colleague was. And all of a sudden I came across, an RTC in a dual carriageway in one of the parkways in Peterborough. And I knew that I obviously had to do something. So I stopped and started to close the carriageway. So there I was all on my own, putting my cones out. Fortunately, nobody was seriously injured. But it was, the road was completely closed. There was glass everywhere. And I'm thinking, I can't do this on my own. I really need some help. So I just about managed to get onto the radio, because obviously the noise of the dual carriageway still running on the other side made it almost impossible to listen. And then, just like the Ride of the Valkyries, I saw some flashing lights in the distance, and I kind of recognized that a road policing car had obviously, attended site, and they put what's called a rolling roadblock on. But I couldn't hear a word they were trying to tell me over the radio. And it's just like, can that special please? And I just couldn't hear a word. Anyway, this car pulled up to about 3 meters in front of me with all these lines of traffic behind. And these two lovely officers jumped out. It's like, we're here to help. Are you okay? It's all good. It's all fine. But I just couldn't hear a word you were saying. These guys were amazing, so calm under those sorts of circumstances. And within about 5 or 10 minutes, we'd cleared the road. We'd got all the people in the crash sorted out, and the traffic was flowing again. But for me, that was a real, just a learning experience, despite the fact that, I'm a COO and I do this. Sometimes you need people's help, and you've just got to, reach out. And fortunately, I had a radio, and that one worked.
Well, you were talking about needing people's help and the importance of not trying to do things on your own, but having a really good team. I think you and I have talked before about the incomplete leader leading a complete team. And you were telling us where we're chatting, Ben and I, with you before about which team you found has been the most inspiring team dealing with crises. Do you want to just talk about an inspiring team that you know? and what it is that makes that such a good team, and what lessons others could take about putting a good team together or making it a better team.
Yeah, I think when you get into sort of very senior leadership roles, the most important thing that you can do is make the right appointments, and spend time getting that right. And I think I would probably look to the team that I've got at the moment, my senior operational leadership team at the Genome campus and Sanger Institute. This is a team that we've convened only really in the last sort of 2.5 years. But by design, they're from different sectors, they have different backgrounds. And one might think that, having such a mixture, wasn't a good recipe, but actually it's the best recipe. They are diverse, Fortunately, our gender balance, we've been able to get that right. So our ops team is 50-50 on that balance, but they're from different sectors, from engineering, from science, from commerce, and they all bring a different set of perspectives. And I think it's my job to, to allow them, to give them the freedom to think, to give them the right landscape in which they can deliver their roles, make sure that they're aligned with the strategy of what we're trying to achieve with the Institute, and then absolutely play them to their strengths. And what's become completely apparent over the last 10 weeks and longer is, this group have gelled so well. I've never really worked with a team like it. Importantly, they look after each other. And I think that's, really important in these current times. They've set up a slightly irreverent WhatsApp group where they have a good time together socially. We have a drop-in session every morning where we have tea and coffee together, and I think they all bring a different perspective. They're willing to challenge, but it's in a safe place. So challenging is an appropriate thing to be able to do, and I think that creates such a positive vibe that great things come from that.
Yeah, it's fantastic to have that quality team.
Just a quick one, but yeah, just a quick one before you move on from your team, because I don't think we sort of covered actually what your team's doing in the light of the current crisis. I know you're doing some really sort of important work, and it sounds fascinating. I just thought it would be good to sort of find out a bit about that.
Yeah, of course, Ben. So you can imagine our scientists have been sort of chomping at the bit to get their hands on COVID-19 and think about research that they can do. So we've started, I think, about another 12 areas of research associated with COVID, looking at a whole range of different areas, as well as trying to maintain some of the other activities of the Institute. But I think some of the most important work that we're doing at the moment is actually sequencing the viral genome. There is a group that's been pulled together that is a combination of NHS laboratories around the country, universities, Public Health England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, as well as the Sanger Institute, that's focusing on sequencing the viral genome from pretty much all locations around the country. Because understanding the viral genome allows us to give real insights into the epidemiology of the disease and how it's kind of changing and developing over time. And I think using sequencing or next generation sequencing as a tool to do this is actually going to be really important, not just now, but in the future. There will be some potential challenges in the future around viral spikes and these sorts of things, and we need to be on top of those and understanding what that means within our country, but also globally. And I think that piece of work is going to be really important in allowing us to do that.
And those subtle differences as it changes over time is going to give you almost like a map of how it's spread from different place to place.
Yeah, exactly. Every time the virus replicates, it makes mistakes. It's it's a blueprint, and blueprints can have errors in them and change over time. And actually, that's kind of what natural selection evolution is all about, really. But we're able to track those, and that allows us then to understand how the disease is spreading, if you like, from one person to the next, or within a particular population or a particular area. It will give some real insights to the decision makers.
Yeah. It sounds like from our early conversation that you and the scientists and all your operations team feel a real sense of purpose and focus at this time to help those who are trying to save lives and sort of stop it in the future or understand it in the future, because a bit like flu, it'll probably be with us for many years, but if we can understand it more, at least we can manage it better.
Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. And from your inspiring team that you're currently working with, you as an academic and a scientist, you've been commercial, charity, public, still a special customer in spare time. What about, you were talking about some of your early days in Liverpool when you had to go abroad. What I'd love another story.
Okay.
When things go wrong in a crisis.
Yeah. So it's fair to say I was quite a late developer, Jonathan. Okay. So when I started my my PhD at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, I didn't have a passport. And I hadn't, I was like 19, 20 years old. Oh, I wasn't older than that. I was about 21, 22. I hadn't been out the country. And within, I don't know, about 6 months of starting at the Trop Shop, as we called it affectionately, I was organizing trips to, Venezuela, Costa Rica. These were sort of field trips related to the research. And I remember on one trip, I was out there with Professor Ward, who actually was a great mentor of mine, actually, and really really spurred me on, and actually got me to register for a PhD in the first place, and gave me, a whole sort of opportunity that I hadn't even realized would be on the cards. So I was with him and in Venezuela, actually, with a couple of technicians and a professor from out there, and we were staying in a really small medical center on the Colombian-Venezuelan border, which is, an interesting place to spend some time, I have to say. One has to be careful who you speak to. But obviously we were there because, we were investigating a disease called leishmaniasis and the sandfly vector, and that's the work that we were doing. And I sort of went down into the medical center one day from the place where we were staying, and Prof. Ward, who, very calm gentleman, said, "Oh, by the way, Martin, there's been a revolution." What do you mean there's been a revolution? There's been a coup in Venezuela, and bless him. So we managed to kind of carry on with our work, but there were some really quite hairy times when we came across sort of men with guns that wanted money for us to be able to carry on doing our research. But it was interesting that even then I was quite young. As an experience, it's always kind of stayed with me that life still goes on. You can still have conversations with people. You can still make things happen, despite the fact that all of this turmoil is kind of happening around you. And we went back the next year to the same location, and we carried on that longitudinal study. But it was an interesting life lesson for me at a tender age of 22.
Yeah, boy. And so before I hand over to Ben for some quick fire questions, what would be from that experience and other things in crisis, what would be your top tip on inspiring leadership that you'd pass on to people? Practical thing that served you well then, now, and that kind of stuff that might help others?
I suppose there's two things I'd make reference to, really. One of them is, to lead, it's not about the talking, it's the listening. You have to be a really profound, active listener. And quite often, the people that talk a lot aren't necessarily great leaders. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, where you should be, driven by the evidence. And sometimes taking the extra time and effort to gather that evidence before you make a decision is really important, rather than just making, the ad hoc emotional decisions.
Very good. Thanks, Martin. Ben, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Great talking to you, Martin. Thanks so much for coming along for this. It's a subject that is fascinating to me. I'm a bit of a scientist at heart. That was I started my career in science and microbiology and marine biology until I could realize there wasn't a lot of money to be made on the beach, but fascinated with microbiology. So great to have you along. So this section is to give people a chance to ask questions. So anybody that's listening in, please do post questions, share, get involved. But while we wait for the questions to come through, I just do some quick fire questions, looking at the habits that you formed over the years to make you successful and help you as a leader. And it's titled healthy, wealthy, and wise. So
Yeah,
if you're ready, we'll jump straight in with the first question. And just sort of looking at your current situation, it's pretty high pressure. There's some important work to do. How do you stay healthy during these sort of times of crisis, both sort of mentally and physically? What's really important?
Yeah, so I think it's making sure that you have time for yourself, and that you can, take yourself away from that stressful environment and do something different. Now, there are a couple of things that I do at the moment for that. Believe it or not, one of them is being a special constable. It sounds really strange to say, you're going from one potentially stressful environment into one that's potentially even more stressful. But it is, you are so focused when you're doing that role that everything else outside of that role just disappears for a little while. It's a bit like skiing. When you ski down the mountain, you are completely focused on not falling over, hitting a tree, hitting somebody else. And I find that actually really great and really invigorating. Now, at the moment, I've stepped away from the special constabulary for a little bit because of all the other issues that I'm managing. So I do miss it, I have to say. But the other thing that I do is almost at the other end, which is behind the barn where we live here. I managed to convince my wife and my mother-in-law, who lives with us, that I should steal a little bit of land. And about 10 years ago, I put an allotment in there. And that's almost at the other extreme. It's quite calming. And actually to spend some time seeing the changes of the seasons and the plants coming through and the growing, that's the other way that I relax. And sometimes I get some really decent veg off the allotment, but not necessarily always.
Nice. That calming moment. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. That calming moment.
Okay, brilliant. And second subject area is wealthy. Obviously, in this time of crisis, there's a lot of people who are struggling. There's a lot of people that have been put in situations which are tough. So we've been looking for any sort of nuggets of wisdom around wealthy to pass on. So is there any pieces of advice that you've had over the years about money that you could pass on?
I just, so I've for a long time sort of worked in the charity sector, not really worked in industry, not really been motivated actually that much by money. For me, it's actually more about the organization that I'm working for and what it is that they're trying to achieve. But you do, even before COVID, we'd had a decade of really quite difficult financial times. And I think for employers, it's about creating a workplace that gives individuals choice. I think that's really important. So, we're working towards having a really flexible benefits approach so that, when you're in your early 20s and what you want to do is save a deposit for a house, you might want to put slightly less into your pension fund at that point because you've got a different goal in life. And as an employer, I think it's really important that we give that flexibility of approach to individuals and move away from perhaps the more sort of patriarchal approach that we've had within society. And I think that's really important. And I think that's one of the things that we can contribute as an employer.
Yeah, definitely. And finally, on this section, just looking at a piece of wisdom. So something that you strive to live your life by.
So I think it would be, for me, it would be around honesty and integrity. These are two things that are absolutely at the top of my tree. I've done some development work with Jonathan, and he would tell you that I'm actually at the extreme end in those two domains. But with my work that I do with the police, I also do some work for the professional standards department. And I do the day one inductions for all of the new special constables that are starting their training. And when you look at the 12 different values that are completely important to being a police officer, honesty and integrity are number one at the top of the tree. And if you find yourself in a position where you breach those in some way, be it to yourself or to others, I think at that point, you've lost the plot at that point. I think those are the two most important things.
Yeah.
Awesome. Really good to get the answer to those questions. So we haven't got any questions coming in at the moment, but one that I had was around the work you're actually doing on COVID, and just sort of looking at, there's so much information that's coming through about the possibility of getting a sort of vaccine in quick fashion. I wondered if you had, given your sort of experience, a bit of an idea of how that process is going, and the reality that it probably will take a lot longer than we're expecting.
Yeah, so it's fascinating, isn't it, that that science is so focused. It's like a laser at the moment on COVID, and I don't think we've really seen such an international focus on a scientific challenge in modern times. Putting a man on the moon was one thing. That was one country, fascinating engineers. What we're trying to achieve with COVID is a bit like that, but on a global perspective. And I think it's researchers and science's responsibility to be open and transparent with the data that's being generated and share that globally, because this isn't about one individual making a big breakthrough. It's about myriad pieces of a jigsaw puzzle coming together to be able to take things forward. So the vaccine's a fascinating story. There are probably upwards of 100 different vaccines being looked at globally. There are a number in this country, and all over the world. And I think, it's fair to say that we've not really seen, that sort of endeavor ever, actually, to be honest with you. But there is tainted with realism. This is a product that we're going to have to potentially, inject into, every human on the planet to be able, or a fair proportion of every human on the planet to be able to control the disease. And that's a massive challenge. So, it comes with a very big sort of caveat that it is such a significant challenge.
Yeah, no, totally. Such a balance, and it's such a weird thing that in scientific relationships, everybody is sharing data, and it has to be a real sort of global effort. But then actually, the virus is forcing us to be very separated as a world, as a race.
There's a complete paradox there, isn't there?
Yeah.
So there are preprints going up on the internet of scientific information. I mean, that was kind of happening before COVID, but even more so now, people kind of openly sharing data. So all of the genomic data that we've created is in an open public archive that people can go and access. Yeah. That's really important. But it is fascinating that what's been most successful so far is a 2,000-year-old approach to controlling infectious diseases.
Yeah. So we've got a question coming from the stream. So Lee Pike, he's a facilities manager. He's asking, what would be your top tip for leaders bringing people back into the workplace and managing that change? So it's probably a good question to both of you, really.
No. So the steps that we're going through is obviously, understanding your estate and understanding the pinch points within the estate. So, our sort of FM team are modeling things like capacity for different areas of the buildings. But what's really important is those points within the building where people are going to come together, and how you manage those effectively. The actual document that the UK government has designed, there's one specifically around research and research institutes, and there are some brilliant. It's actually a really good document, I have to say. So my head of FM and my head of health and safety actually agreed on something, which was this was a really good document. Actually had some really sensible stuff inside, and I'd use that as a point of reference for people, and then just being really clear about the kind of the employer's responsibility in all of this, and making the workplace as safe as possible. And that's about using different channels to engage with people. So there's all the physical signage that you need to put out. There is a new induction. So we've created a whole new induction for people coming back onto the campus that we will roll out with individuals as they start to come back, because it looks and feels so different. Then another one is culturally as well. And it's, it's almost, you need to have a culture where it's okay to talk to people about. That's Siri just going off on one, by the way. She doesn't quite understand, apparently.
No.
But culturally, it's, you know, you need a workplace where people are happy to challenge and question. So if you see a couple of colleagues, you know, that you know, sat too close together, people need the courage to be able to say, actually, guys, you know, is that an appropriate thing to be doing? Do you want to move a little bit further apart? Need to be a little bit careful there, because we've also moved to family pods in some areas as well. And that's about having the similar level of epidemiological risk of infection, just to kind of manage, you know, the site as effectively as we can.
Yeah.
That's great advice. Yeah.
Fascinating. And we were talking with Ben, you and I, before about diversity and inclusion, particularly in scientific careers, particularly because there's always that challenge of many men and women beginning at the beginning, but higher up in science, it thins out and you get less and less women going through, and it's a real challenge. You've just got an award. Do you want to just tell us about the award that you've got at the Sanger Institute, and how you're trying to make it fairer and greater diversity and more inclusion?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So, you know, over the last sort of 3-4 years, we've worked really hard around equality and inclusion. And there is a national award scheme for research institutes and the higher education sector, which is called Athena Swan. So a couple of weeks ago, we got notification that we've achieved the Silver Award for Athena Swan, which is absolutely fantastic. You know, our kind of people that work in EDI and more broadly across the organisation are actually really very proud of that achievement. But there is a significant challenge in academia in women achieving those very senior roles. There is very much a structural deficit, you know, in those senior roles. And I always kind of hark back to the time when I was chief exec at the Royal Statistical Society, and we had a group called Career Young Statisticians. So these were people that, you know, passed their master's, PhD, perhaps sort of 3 to 5 years into their career. And I was, they have a head office, which is an old Victorian school near the Barbican. And they've converted the old school hall into a meeting room. And I looked out at these career young statisticians. There are probably about 200 in the room, something like that. And I'd say about 130 of them were women. And yet when you go and speak to the senior professors in statistics around the country, the vast majority of them are men. So there's something, you know, about life choices that people take that means that, you know, the right number of women don't get into those senior roles. And the challenge that we, you know, are constantly thinking about is, what are the policies, you know, what are the approaches, what supports do we need to have in place to say it's kind of, you know, we need to do this in a different way. We need to be better at this. But it's a challenge right across academia in those senior roles. Yeah.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to hand over to Ben, see if Ben's got any more questions or anything that come to mind. I've got a few up my sleeve, but just wonder, Ben, what about you?
Sure. Yeah. So just sort of looking at that question of diversity and inclusion, where do you sort of see is science an area where you see that predominantly, or do you think it's something that's a problem in lots of different areas? I know we have the same in LinkedIn in different parts of the business, and we do a lot of work around that. But is it a universal problem?
I think it's a universal problem. You just need to look at the way that people are mandating women on boards. I mean, there are some countries where you have to have a quota. That comes with a whole set of challenges. That sense of pull within the system does come with, with some significant challenge. So it's not just academia, I have to say. It is true of other sectors. Some organizations, have been better at solving these problems. From my perspective, on the operational side, there are some tricks I can use to redress that balance. So if I'm fortunate enough to work with a headhunter to look for a senior operational role, I can demand that they bring me a gender split 50-50 shortlist, and actually give them a bit more time so that they can achieve that. With what's called the faculty roles, these are the sort of senior scientific roles. that's much more difficult to do. And there are different ways of sort of anonymizing recruitment processes, but when your saleable product are your publications, that's very difficult to do as well. So you can't really anonymize that recruitment process. So there are some significant challenges. I think it's more about creating a workplace where we can be as supportive as we possibly can, so that people can make the right career choices at the right time. I think that's the nub of it to a certain extent.
And I was just going to build on that. In my own experience over the last 20 to 40 years, there are certain sectors I've worked in where there is a better gender balance, and particularly in senior meetings, you get far greater levels with more gender balance, far greater levels of emotional and social intelligence. People forget what you say, they forget what you do, but they never forget how you make them feel. And I think time and again, particularly in tech, startups, scientific businesses, academia, people have got very hurt, very sore by the way they've been treated by a male-dominated leadership team who just sometimes high IQ, not well-developed EQ, and just get it wrong, say the wrong thing, like, got to get you all back to work because your productivity isn't as good as it should be. So come back now. None of this faffing around. Just get back to work. Well, hello. Are you aware of all the fear and stuff we've been stirring up? I mean, I don't know what thoughts you have, Martin.
Yeah, I think it's difficult, isn't it, in a very much results orientated setting. And the work that we do is absolutely leading edge, and we want scientists that are leading edge. But it's about creating an environment where there's also some sense of care in how you do that and striking that appropriate balance. And I think that's actually going to be really important in academia over the next few years. And I can see the grant giving bodies almost demanding this of the science base. It's not just what you do, it's how you do it that's really important as well. And bringing those two things together and having a dialogue about that, I think, is going to be really important.
And I think also you touched on something else when you're in particularly academia, science, and technical businesses where being right is very important. It's almost part of your identity to actually have the vulnerability to admit, sorry guys, I was a bit insensitive there and I actually got it wrong. I'm sorry, please forgive me. I'm working on it. I'm work in progress. I'm an incomplete leader leading a complete team. And I don't see enough of them admitting when they're wrong in the way they've handled people.
Yeah, no, I can see that. But I also get a sense that there is a growing maturity around that issue. I can see it. I can see it where I work. I can see our senior scientists taking their own personal development very seriously, and actually being very reflective. Which is a very good thing. We just need to kind of promulgate that now, as much as we possibly can, and get people talking about it.
Yeah, that's very true.
Also think it's completely key for actually the situation we're in, and you made the point earlier, Martin, having the open enough leadership to have people say, do you know what, I'm not comfortable with how we're going back to work, or how the back to work process is being done, or these people being together, and being able to put your hand up is going to be so vital in this relaxing of lockdown as we go along.
We have to.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think we have to create an environment, where we're kind to each other. Actually, that's what it needs, within the bounds of legal structures and health and safety and employment law and all of those sorts of things. But actually, we just need to be kind to each other at the moment.
That's very true.
Yeah, understanding.
Before Ben asks you about what book you're reading as a final thought, what would be one of your last top tips on being an inspiring, or who's inspired you? A practical tip that you'd pass over, and then Ben can ask you about books, and we'll wrap up.
So I'm not actually reading a book at the moment, Ben. I'm very disappointed with myself. I've just been so overawed by the last few weeks and the things that we've had to deal with that. See, I normally listen to books whilst I'm traveling to work in the car with the audio books. And, you know, sadly, I've kind of, because I've been working from home, fallen out of that habit. So that's one of the impacts that COVID's had on me, is that my normal, quite sort of, you know, throughput of books has reduced very significantly.
Yeah, me too, yeah.
And the last tip, you know, combination of, you know, just being honest, having integrity, and expecting that from others as well, Jonathan, and demanding that from others, I think is really important for any inspiring leader.
Yeah. Well, Martin, thank you so much for being on the LinkedIn Live series. People recommended you. That's why you're here. It's not because you said, oh, I think I'll come on the show. People said that you are a man of honesty and integrity, and you do lead by example. And the different things you've done in academia, commercial, charity, public, the police in your spare time, and being the CEO of such a huge campus with over 2,000 people is an example to us all. So I think we've all got a lot to take from it. So from me and Ben, thank you very much indeed. And good to have you on the show.
Jonathan, Ben,
thanks very much,
Martin. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Take care. Thank you.